With that exception, I remember, something about him.
Like, for example?
Tubi Scarpino.
Yeah.
Thing I remember about him, he would always get mad, and then when the conversation ended, as far as he's concerned, he hung up. He never said goodbye.
Bye.
Yes.
Who else? You see a name like it?
Oh, George Jude.
Yeah.
I remember when he was up, seeing him up in court in Mayville one day, and when I walked in there, he was trying a lawsuit, and he was over 80 years old.
Oh, no kidding.
And Willard Cass was on the other side, and I think George Jude won the lawsuit, which was amazing, absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Now I don't look upon that as old as it was then. Art Laudenslager, see that picture of him, and I think of real estate deals because he was really an expert and seemed to handle all those for a right firm. And of course, Ernie Leet.
Yeah.
You knew when you had something with him that it was going to, everything that he did would be done and done again until it was perfect. He would go into detail so much it would drive you crazy. And Marion Fisher. Marion Fisher was a terrific lawyer, and he was Mr. Perfection. And I remember I was the attorney for the town of Bootey, and he was attorney for the village of Lakewood, oddly enough. I mean, he had a tremendous practice, big clients, big fees, and he accepted appointment as attorney for the village of Lakewood. And there was a rabies scare in the county, and so the village of Lakewood asked him to draft an ordinance to help prevent rabies. Town of Bootey, I was on the town board, asked me to do a little ordinance for the town. And then Fisher said, I understand you're going to be doing one for the town. Why can't we get together and jointly do one that would be for both? And I said, that's fine. And that was the experience of my life. Fisher didn't mind whether he was working during office hours or whether it was after hours, whether it was on Sunday or when. His secretaries knew when they went to work for him that they were on call. One of his former secretaries worked for me years later, and she, every night when she left the office, her desk was absolutely neat and clean, everything put away where it should be. But maybe she left the office at 5:45 instead of 5 o'clock. But she had been trained by Fisher, and she said she never left his office when she worked for him that he didn't say, now, where are you going to be over the weekend in case I need you?
I'll be there.
And she said she was always on call, and frequently on Saturday he'd call and he said, I've got some things I've got to get out. I'd like you to be down the office at 8 o'clock or something. And she did. And so on the, he'd call me, my office, and ask me if I could run over to his office. He was working on something about the ordinance. So I went over there, and he would dictate. And Elsie, who was then his secretary, took it all by shorthand. And he would pace back and forth and dictate a paragraph. And then he'd have it read back, and then he'd change it. Finally, he'd say, okay, run off a draft of that. So she'd go out and type out the draft and bring it in, copy for me and copy for him. We'd talk about it, and he says, and I'd think it was pretty good. And he'd say, no, I think I'll change that. I'd like to change it to do so-and-so. So I bet he had 10 drafts of every paragraph in that thing. That he would, unbelievable. When he got all through, and we both felt it was about as perfect as it could be, and it went to our respective boards, and there was only one or two things in there we didn't agree upon, and our town left it out, and the village put in, but it wasn't anything material. And he got a phone call from the Commissioner of Agricultures and Markets in Albany, saying somebody had just sent him a copy of the Village of Lakewood the rabies ordinance, and he had been working on something for state regulations, and he wondered if Fisher had any objections if he used the provisions in the Lakewood ordinance. So the Agricultures and Market Law, I think, was amended to have provisions about rabies taken from the Village of Lakewood. That's the way Fisher was.
Wow.
And on that, I think it was on that same ordinance, one night, Saturday night, my wife and I were going out, and just before we were to leave, we were meeting some others for dinner or something, I got a phone call. It was from Fisher, and I said, when I answered, Bob, this is Marion Fisher. And I looked at my wife, and he said, I wonder if you could stop by. I'm working on this ordinance. He said there's some provisions in there that I thought I'd like to go over with you and see what you think. I said, my wife and I are just going out for dinner and so on and so forth. It wouldn't be a good time. Well, just stop by, and just stop by. It won't take very long. See? So what do? Stopped by, and my wife sat in the car, and I went in his house. And it was something that we got resolved fairly quickly. But that was Fisher.
Yeah.
And I can understand why he commanded big fees if he charged for his time, because his time was always working towards perfection. Oh, I don't know, every one there I could think of things.
Does this guy name up here mean anything to this guy Miles Boughton?
Boughton, sure. He was a lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
but he didn't practice law.
Okay.
He was a newspaper. He was with a newspaper, and he wrote a column, and he had overseas experience as a reporter, and he was an excellent speaker. And I remember we used to have him come to the Kiwanis Club and give a speech once in a while, and he was a good friend of my father's, and so I knew him reasonably well. But I don't think he ever practiced law.
Were you destined to be a lawyer?
I think probably I was. I'm the third generation of lawyers. My grandfather, I'm the third. My grandfather, Edward R. Bootey III, first. He died 100 years ago. He died in 1900. And he fought in the Civil War, and people say, if I say my grandfather fought in the Civil War, they say, don't you mean your great-grandfather? And I said, no. But interestingly, my wife, who's 7 or 8 years younger than I am, her grandfather also fought in the Civil War, which is amazing.
Wow.
And so, but my grandfather, Bootey, he was a trial lawyer. He was a good trial lawyer. And he served a couple terms as district attorney, corporation counsel in the city. And he died at 61, but then 61 wasn't what it is today.
Mm-hmm. I saw his picture in our office in Fredonia.
Oh, is that
It's
right?
a 1903 photo, but it included members of the bar who were from way back when, and it had the time period. I think your grandfather must have died 1900.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Edward R. Bootey.
Yeah,
There's a picture of him. We just saw it yesterday.
yeah.
So then your dad also was a lawyer?
Yeah, my dad was a lawyer. He was, his dad died in 1900, and my dad graduated from Albany Law School in, I think, I don't know, was it 1902 or 3 or 4 or something like that. And then he was admitted and he practiced. He died in 1942. Sudden. But I had been admitted, so I was in with him for a year or two before he died. which was a good thing for both of us.
Oh, yeah.
And
Where did you go to law school?
Albany Law.
Albany Law?
It's where Jackson went.
Yeah, that's right. Now, you were talking before about your parents interfacing with the Robert Jackson and their family. How'd that
Well,
go?
the first time I remember having anything to do with the Jackson family was I was very small, very young.
Mhm.
And we were at their home on Fairmount Avenue, which I can never understand is not known as the Robert H. Jackson home. It's a beautiful home. And it just seems to me that should somehow be memorialized. And I don't remember much about it because I was extremely young. But being there, I think we were there and had dinner with them. And I remember going out in the backyard, and it seemed big and beautiful and all to a small child.
Mhm.
That was my first recollection of Jackson. Although I'd heard my father and mother speak of Bob and Irene Jackson and so on and so forth. And, of course, I got older. I knew he was a real good lawyer in town.
Mhm.
And but I personally didn't have any contact with him. But when I was 5 years old, I should say that was the next personal contact with him. When I was 5 years old, before I was 5, I was real sick, and I don't know whether I had pneumonia or what I had, but as a 4-year-old. And the doctor finally told my folks that he thought the best thing to do would be to get me down south somewhere where there was some warm weather and I would get over whatever I had very quickly. So we went to Puerto Rico.
Mhm.
And I remember we took a train to New York City where my folks had a couple of friends of theirs, and our host there, where we had dinner that night, and I think we spent the night there and then took a boat the next day. And we had dinner, and that was my birthday.
Mm.
And that was my 5th birthday. And I'll never forget the chicken dinner we had at their home, and it was terrific. And Mr. Lockwood, Clark Lockwood was his name. His father was a very well-known, able lawyer in Jamestown years before. And then we went to Puerto Rico, and we got down there, and Bob and Irene Jackson were also in Puerto Rico. Now, I don't know if they knew it in advance, either the Jacksons or us, but during the time we were in Puerto Rico, I did quickly get well and ran around. In fact, on the boat down there, I was supposed to take it easy and not go up and down the stairs, but everyone else in the family got sick, and I was getting better, so I would go up the stairs on the boat and then slide down the rail. And I remember that. We got down there, and I remember this particular occasion. I guess I told you about it. When the Jacksons and Booteys, and I was the only kid that was there, were down on the ocean, but nobody had bathing suits on. I don't know what we were doing down there, but anyway, my dad or mother had a camera, and so they thought it'd be nice to have a picture of the 4 of them. And I said, let me take the picture. I'd never taken the picture. And my dad said, you think you can? I said, sure. And he gave me the camera, and he said, now, be sure and get it centered and hold it very steady and so on, and when you get everything just right, push down here. So I said, okay. So the Jacksons and the Booteys stood up there, the 4 of them, and I got it all lined up, and I pushed down, and my dad, oh, Bob, he said, you had your finger over the lens. I said, no, I didn't. He says, yes, you did. He said, take another one and make sure you don't have it, your finger over it. And instead of advancing the thing, he said, you had your finger over, so just go ahead and take another right there. So I did. And then they said, I think that was all right, but if there's any question in your mind, let's take a third one. So I took a third one. And the first two, the first one was a double exposure. So it was like this, you know. The third one was all right.
Yeah.
Now, I never threw away that double exposure, and I would have given anything if I could find that.
Yeah.
This morning, my wife was looking again for it, and she found a couple of interesting letters that I have with me, but she didn't find that picture. But I know that I would never have thrown that away. When Sandra Day O'Connor was here for the dedication of the statue, I went up and talked to her, and I told her about the picture taking and so on, and she got a big kick out of that. In college, I went to Randolph-Macon College in Ashland, Virginia, and I don't know what the occasion was, but there was a dance, a prom, or something, some weekend, and I was thinking it may have been a graduation, but it apparently was in 1938, and my graduation would not have been in 38. That would have been my second year there. I apparently wrote a letter to Mary Jackson inviting her to come to the prom.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talked to you, I didn't know what happened except she couldn't come. And but among the letters this morning that my wife was going through, there was a letter from Jackson himself.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, and the Solicitor General. And I thought this was kind of interesting. My dear Bob. Now that's interesting too,
Yeah.
that he called me Bob. You know, a lot of people who don't know me very well call me Robert, which kind of provokes me. But he said, my dear Bob, I'm going to have to put on my Coca-Cola glasses. I was out of the city when your letter to Mary came to the office, and I'm sorry that I did not get it to her much sooner. I will look forward to seeing you. With best wishes, sincerely, Robert Jackson.
Prom had probably come and gone, right?
I don't know. I kind of think that I got a phone call from her saying that she had gotten my letter or something, but and she was replying by a phone call because she just got it and so on, and she regretted that she had other plans for that weekend or something. I don't know. And then here's a letter. This is dated February 15th, 1938. It's addressed to my father.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather's was known by the name of Ed Bootey. My father, with the same name, was called Ned, and I, with the same name, went by my middle name. See, that's why it's E. Robert. And my son, my oldest son, who's in Baltimore, he's the fourth, and we didn't know what to call him. And somebody said Ted, and I said, well, gee, that's a nickname for a Theodore. And they said, what about Ted Kennedy, and named 2 or 3 other Teds. I said, that's fine. I like the nickname Ted,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't necessarily care for Theodore. And so he's always been by the name of Ted. But this says, Dear Ned, I appreciate your letter very much. Well, and this is when he was Assistant Attorney General. While there will be some delay and considerable conversation, I expect that confirming will not be withheld. That was for Solicitor General.
Mhm.
He said, the Solicitor Generalship I regard to be the highest prize in the whole government service, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I never knew that he had said, I don't ever remember seeing this letter. For a lawyer who likes advocacy, I hope I shall be able to fill it so as to justify the good opinion of you and my fellow lawyers. I noted by the papers that Mary, that's my mother, is south and hope she will have a pleasant trip. We often speak of our trip to Puerto Rico. So this, of course, was written long after we were in Puerto Rico. With best regards and good wishes to you and Mary, in which Irene joins. Sincerely yours, Bob. And that I thought was a nice, wanted to look at it.
Those are great. I'm glad you kept those.
Yeah, same here.
So he was Assistant Attorney General at the time, and he'd been appointed subject to
Confirmation.
confirmation as
Yes.
Solicitor General.
Yeah.
Oh, isn't that nice?
And I thought it was kind of interesting that Bob Jackson, when he was here, and he practiced here, he represented big clients, corporate clients,
Mhm.
and banks, and so on. And it seemed to me that his practice was along the lines of big money interests. And at least that's what we hear about. And then when he got to Washington, and he was a Democrat here. He was the leading Democrat, and he was a well-known Democrat in Democratic circles throughout the state, and certainly Roosevelt knew of his expertise and ability as a lawyer, not necessarily one who advocated the same policies that Roosevelt had, but as a lawyer advocating his client's positions. And so I can understand why he would have brought Jackson to Washington. And then when he was a Solicitor General and representing the government in arguing cases before the United States Supreme Court, I thought it was interesting that he was now representing big government, and particularly where before he went in that position, he was in the antitrust division, which seemed to me he was still showing expertise, but kind of on the other side,
Yeah.
which I thought was very interesting. I think that he was a graduate of Albany Law School, and he gave the commencement address at my college. I was not at that address. I did not hear. He also gave the commencement address at Albany Law School the year I graduated. And probably the next time I had any personal contact with him was at a bar association meeting over in the hotel. And I don't know what the occasion was that he was here, why he was here, but anyway, he was there. And I had the good fortune of sitting at a table over there, at the same table where he was. I don't remember who else was at the table, and that didn't particularly matter, but I was one of maybe 5 sitting there. And I can't remember what it was that came up, the subject of a presidential proclamation or a request or something. And I think that it was about a declaration of war. And he said the president, but he was Attorney General at the time, and I didn't check to see when he was Attorney General, but it was during that period. And he said that the president, the subject of Roosevelt came up, and there was a discussion of it. And he said Roosevelt was very able man, and he said, and it's not the people he has around him. He himself has an extreme amount of ability and so on and so forth. And he said an example. He said to me, I want you to draft a resolution or a proclamation or something declaring war and get it to me as quickly as you can. And Jackson said, well, I said, just what do you want in that declaration? And Roosevelt took a piece of paper and said, well, something like this. And he scribbled 2 or 3 sentences. And he said, something like that. And he gave it to Jackson. And Jackson said, I took it to the office and I struggled and worked and I tried writing things. And I got all through and I said, I can't improve on what he wrote. And that's what it was.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. Did Bob talk at all about the policies of Mr. Jackson? Talk at all about the policies of Roosevelt to pack the court? Did you ever?
No.
It was very controversial.
Oh, yes. I remember so well. And I could not conceive of, well, when Hugo Black was appointed, I could not conceive of such a terrible thing, because Hugo Black, as you may well recall, was a ward healer down in Alabama or somewhere, and a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, and I think he served as municipal judge for a short period of time, and that was his background. And then when Roosevelt appointed, then he was elected to Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And then Roosevelt appointed him because he wanted some New Dealers, people who would support him and that would do as he wanted. Not necessarily guys of real strong opinions, but would go along with him. And he was appointed. And there was a big controversy. The guy isn't qualified. And I think Frankfurter was on the court at the time, a constitutional law professor in Harvard or something, and so on and so forth, and a brain. And it just didn't make sense that they would appoint this dumb ward healer from somewhere. And they tell me, I don't know whether this is true or not, but I believe it, that Hugo Black, after a bitter fight was confirmed, went on the bench, and he went to Frankfurter and said, you know, I don't know any constitutional law, I haven't had judicial experience, and he said, I understand you're a constitutional law professor from Harvard and so on. He said, how about giving me a course in constitutional law? Did you ever hear this?
No.
And he said, yeah. He said, I'd be glad to. So Black went to Frankfurter's home. I guess it was in a hotel or something. Or I don't think Frankfurter was married. And so he went over there 2 or 3 nights a week and took a good course in constitutional law from Frankfurter.
My word.
And Frankfurter, you'd think that with his philosophy and being on the bench and knowing constitutional law, he would have taught Black the course consistent with his own philosophy. But it turned around that as they were on the court longer and others came on, it ended up there were 2 factions of the court. The Hugo Black liberal faction and the Frankfurter, then the conservative faction. See? And they were generally on opposite sides. And they said that Black carried his Constitution with him. He did. I know it.
Really?
Because I sat at the table with him. And Black sat there, I sat here, I don't remember who sat here, but on this side was, remember Justice Burton, Harold Burton from Ohio? He sat here. And he was a down-to-earth guy, but Black, he was talking high constitutional stuff there. See?
This was at Jackson's.
This was at Jackson's funeral,
Yeah.
and this was out at Moonbrook. And I was so impressed with Black. I could not believe that this was the same Black that 15 or 20 years before, didn't know what the Constitution was hardly.
Yeah.
And when he was talking, he said, now for instance, and he pulls out his Constitution, a well-worn, kind of thin, black-covered book. He pulled it out and he said, Article so-and-so says, and he said, let me read it to you. He was talking, everyone started to listen to him. See? And he was expounding on that. And then he said, but contrary to this is so-and-so in the Constitution. And those, he went ahead like that. It was just
So
amazing.
impressive, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was impressed. Harold Burton was the nicest guy, as I say, down to earth, but he wasn't up in that stratosphere that Black was. Black was he was a power on that court. And whoever would have thought it?
He and Jackson didn't get along at all, did they?
Oh, I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
We got you a little bit out of sequence here, but tell me about, while we're on the luncheon, all 8 justices were there, and
Earl Warren was there, and you could tell he was the leader of the group.
Mhm.
Because he arranged the seating. He didn't want the justices to sit together, see?
Mhm.
And he would say, you go over and sit there.
Was there a speech given during that ceremony? Do you remember?
There were, I don't think so. Warren spoke,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't, I thought, extemporaneous thing.
Mhm.
And it was very nice, but nothing memorable. I remember I was a bearer at that funeral, and interestingly enough, I think that's the first time my wife, Sally, ever saw me. She was a teacher at Lincoln,
Mm-hmm.
and she and one of the other teachers went over there and to the Episcopal Church, and were outside and watched. There was a crowd over there,
Mm-hmm.
and she saw the casket being carried out.
Tell me a little bit about the funeral. Were you involved in meeting the justices at the train station?
No,
How were you selected as a pallbearer?
I think I was selected. I'm not sure, but I may have either been the president of the Bar Association or something. I don't remember.
Mm-hmm. Was it when the actual was it a church service itself, or was it
Yeah.
more of a viewing?
No, there was a service.
Mm-hmm.
Governor Dewey was there.
Tell me about that story.
That as I recall, there was a little bit of a something. I think that Dewey was a little upset when he came in that they didn't put him up there in the first row or something. And I was there and watched, and it looked like he was put out, and I think it ended up he sat in the second row or something like that. He felt the governor should be in the first row.
I understand in talking to both John Goodell and who was a pallbearer also, and Charlie Price, they talked about Ernie's Leet and how Ernie Leet was the head usher. And apparently it was Ernie's job to make sure protocol was maintained.
Yeah.
And the protocol was such that the justices, of course, had the front row, not necessarily the first row, because they sat them back a few rows so they could see what was going on. And that Dewey had felt that he was important enough to be in the front, ahead of them. So marched down, and Ernie Leet had the job of convincing Dewey that he wasn't to sit ahead of the justices.
Well, that is probably absolutely correct. I don't remember the details. I don't remember Ernie Leet doing it, or who did it, or how it came to happen. But I know I was there watching, and I thought it was very interesting. And it was apparent that Dewey thought he should be up in front, but he didn't.
Was there a large crowd at the church?
I would say so.
Yeah.
I would say so.
And your job, in fact, there's a picture. Hold on, I got a picture here. he could probably tell me who these guys are. Somebody dropped this off just the other day. I kind of see Sid Hughes there.
Yeah, Sid Hughes and Jerry Herrick in back of him and Alan Cass in front of him.
Who's the front attorney?
On the casket,
Yeah.
that's Alan Cass and Ernie Leet. And the guy in back of him, I can't tell. And I don't know whether, I don't see me. I must be in back of Sid Hughes or in back of
Yeah, there's some people that are
Yeah.
obscured there.
John Goodell, I think, is in back of Ernie Leet. I see, looks like Carl Henderson over here. Gee, Sid Hughes is a lot taller than I remember him. It looks like the one in back here looks like Fred Hitchcock, who was a funeral director with Henderson Lincoln, and that looks like Carl Henderson of Henderson Lincoln.
And you took the casket down to the cemetery in Frewsbury.
Yeah.
And was there a ceremony there?
Just a committal service, as I recall.
John Goodell had one comment. He sort of smiled and he said, as I was carrying the casket, all I could think about were the Egyptian servants as they carried the pharaohs to the tomb, and that if the servant tripped and stumbled and fell, they immediately were replaced and had their head cut off.
No kidding.
And he said, it's the only thing I could think about. And he's laughing because it's the only, as I remember back so many years ago, it was 46 years ago, it's the only thing that flashes through my head, even now, was that fact. Because the ground was so rough. In walking it to the cemetery, where the committal service, he said, if I drop this, I'm dead.
Well, are we on camera?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether I should tell this or not.
Oh,
but
go ahead.
The
Private stock.
years ago, there was a black man in Lakewood, and he was a giant of a man, and he had a boat livery down where the Lakewood beach is now, or where the boathouse, and boat livery, and he was able to find more drowned bodies in Chautauqua Lake than anyone. And Noah Cornish was his name. He was, I bet he must have been 6'8" and 300 and some pounds. But anyway, he was a well-known character around town, and around Lakewood. Well, when he died, Jim Russell, who was former treasurer of the village and the real estate and insurance man in Lakewood, Jim Russell was one of the bearers. And when they took the casket from the church or wherever it was out to the hearse, they were going along, and all of a sudden Jim Russell, he started to chuckle and was suppressing it and all. And he didn't feel that was the appropriate time to laugh very hard. And finally they got it in the hearse, and then they got in the usher's car and started out, and somebody said, Jim, what in the world did you think was so funny that you were trying to suppress a laugh? He says, all the time, or he said, that we started carrying that out, could think of only one thing. Noah's favorite expression. They said, what was that? Something's heavier than a dead nigger.
That's terrific. Oh, that's great. And the Robert Jackson Jr., we got off on the funeral. When he was in the Supreme Court and then was selected to be prosecutor at Nuremberg, what was the general reaction here in Jamestown? Was there a sense of pride? Did you guys follow the trials at all at Nuremberg? Was there?
Oh, I think so. I think there was definitely a sense of pride.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly was an honor to go to the court, and if they wanted the prestige of a Supreme Court judge as a prosecutor, that they selected Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I felt a great deal of pride. You know, we don't individually know famous people very well.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we see someone in government or that becomes famous, I mean, it gives us a good feeling. And then it makes you realize that it really isn't the fact that you know them, except you know them as a person. Like Jackson seemed to be just a regular, normal human being.
Mm-hmm.
And this that we read in the paper would be true, that they were great, but the fact is when you knew him and the letters, like you or I or anyone else might write. See? And I think that's the thing you enjoy about him. I don't think I would enjoy it if I knew some famous person who, when he was here and having lunch with you, he didn't act like a regular human being. He acted like he was a famous person.
Yeah.
And then I don't think I'd take great pride in saying, I know him.
Mm-hmm.
I followed the Nuremberg trial as from the news.
Do you remember him ever talking about it afterwards?
No. Mm-mm. And I don't know as I ever saw him afterwards or heard him speak about it.
Mm-hmm. Always curious. I'm sure if he spoke or wrote or just had some human emotional reaction, whether A, he did a good job, B, the sentences were consistent with what he thought. I never really heard that. Certain guys got acquitted.
Yeah.
The big guys certainly were hung. I got to tell you, just one quick vignette. There is an individual in Celeron named Cecil Wright.
I know him very well.
Okay. I had Cecil in the office 4 or 5 years ago. I read a little piece in the paper about him. And he wondered why I wanted him to come in. I said, I really want to videotape you, I want to talk to you because you have an interesting story. Nah, nothing. So I showed a video on Nuremberg trials, but particularly dealing with the whole Goering episode. That he, cheated the hangman. And it dealt a lot with the prison guards. And so, with him watching it, he didn't know I had sort of a camcorder on him. He really opened up and started talking. Hey, I remember that guy. Isn't that interesting? Oh yeah, those guys could speak English. All the defendants. And I remember Van Poppen. Anyway, open up. And so I got done, and I said, hope you didn't mind, I taped you. And we started asking him questions about the defendants. Goering, Hess, Ribbentrop. And when the day got done, he said, Greg, I still understand why you were interested in talking to me. I leaned forward and I said, but for Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, and Bormann, you met, talked to, played cards with the top members of the Third Reich. I don't know anybody else that can say that. He sit back and says, yeah, I guess you're right. It's like, no big deal. But that was fun. And here's a guy right here in Celeron, New York,
Yeah.
who was there. And I think it's one of the more fascinating stories around.
Yeah. He's a humble guy,
Mm-hmm.
and his wife is a very humble person too. And do you know his wife, Joyce? She was a graduate of the class of 1944 in Jamestown, and in my wife's class, and Charlie Goodell's class, and Jim Roselli's class. That was quite a class, 44. And they have reunions, and they have mini reunions, and they have big turnouts for committees and organizing the big and little mini reunions and so on. And Joyce Wright has never been to a class reunion. And I said to her one day, I saw her, I said, Joyce, why don't you ever come to a class reunion? She said, oh gosh, she said, I don't want to go to those. And I said, why not? She said, I'd go, and then everyone would be bragging about their great accomplishments. And she says, I haven't done anything. And she said, I wouldn't like to go and say a lot of things that aren't true. And so if they said, what do you do, Joyce? She'd say, nothing, just a housewife. But I said, Joyce, you've been a member of the village board. You were clerk or deputy clerk of the village. Yeah, she served on the village board up there and done some other things at the village level. And I'm sure that she would be considered, at least a few years ago, as a prominent woman in village affairs, see. And I said, what more can you want, see? She said, well, some of those people that did big things, they'd be there. And she said, I'm just...
Yeah. Well, Cecil was the same way.
He was mayor.
Cecil was?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's how I got to know him. I was village attorney up there during his
Mm-hmm.
tenure, and some others. But he's a nice guy, and she's a real nice person.
Well, I put together sort of a video montage of the Nuremberg trial.
Is that right?
I stole a lot of clips from a lot of places just to tell the Robert Jackson story, to put it into perspective. Here's a local guy, Jamestown, works his way up, up. And then I found some old video clips of Jackson giving the opening statement, the closing statement. But I interspersed through that little video story, Cecil Wright's story.
Uh-huh.
Harold Adams.
Yeah.
Remember Harold?
Sure.
Harold ended up in Nuremberg. Long story short, but he ended up only there one day to see his Uncle Bob in action. But it was the last day, when they were laying out the verdicts and the sentences.
Mm-hmm.
He was there.
That'd be real interesting.
And Bud Marker, who you may have known from the Journal Press.
Sure. Played
Bud,
golf with him.
There you go. Bud was a photographer who Jackson invited to come to the trial to take photographs and to submit into evidence photographs that Marker had taken at one of the concentration camps.
How about that?
And so these three little disparate local interests. I interviewed Harold and I interviewed Cecil and Bud, who had already died, but I got his pictures from the estate. So kind of put this together and interspersed it with Justice O'Connor when she was here.
Yeah.
A little bit about Jackson. So probably the next couple months I'll show that and I'll let you know. And
I'd
it
love
might be fun, and make sure Cecil sees it and Harold sees it. Because I think it's important, kind of like what we're doing now, for local history purposes, the Robert Jackson story. My sense is that John Hamilton did more. He did an awful lot for this community. But one of the things he really did is he took his position and the money that was available for the Gebby to kind of re-energize the consciousness level of Robert Jackson. You know, he pushed that statue. He pushed that, got O'Connor back, got Bill Jackson back, Mary back.
Was Bill here?
Bill was there. He was at the...
That's funny. I would have... I saw Mary and I went up and spoke to her.
Bill was on the stage.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe when I went up and spoke to her, maybe I guess I do remember he was there. But when I went up and spoke to Mary and talked to her briefly, she didn't say, gee, I'm sorry I never came to that dance.
But that, they had a reception at Moonbrook also afterwards, and Bill spoke, and I glad I taped that.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause nobody else was doing any of that stuff. And he talked about his dad, talked about various points, kind of did a little 10-minute biography, and then at the end apologized for being a partisan about his dad, talking about his dad, and then broke up. You know, it was really poignant.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a guy who's kind of done it all himself.
Yeah.
Wasn't
he Rockefeller's counsel in the hearings on the vice presidency?
Mm-hmm. Jackie Onassis. I mean, he's
Yeah.
played, has his own career, but at that particular time, he was overwhelmed with emotion.
And he died, what, in this last year?
About a month and a half ago.
Yeah.
And Mary died
Oh, she died? Is that right? I didn't
2 or
know
3
that.
years ago. And the Fenton Historic Society received a tremendous amount of Robert Jackson memorabilia,
Oh, that's great.
including his appointment as special prosecutor to Nuremberg, signed by Roosevelt. That, to me, is a
Yeah.
autograph history nut. That's
Oh, yes.
pretty neat stuff.
Oh, that's great.
So it's here in Jamestown. My hope is, well, there's going to be a centennial dinner honoring the Jamestown Bar Association. This is our 100th year. The speaker, if all is well, will be this Eugene Gerhardt, who wrote the biography on Jackson in 1956. He was interviewing Jackson from 1948 through 54 when he died. He's an attorney in Binghamton, 88 years old, sharp as a tack.
Mm.
I went down and interviewed him because I was thrilled, A, he was alive, and B, he was interested. And so I said, you need to come up and to talk at our dinner because you had an unusual relationship with Jackson. And he clearly, from our bar association, is the top alumnus.
Mm. Yeah.
And so I also talked yesterday to George Niebank.
Mm-hmm.
And George is in Hilton Head. I said, we're going to have this event. You clerked for Jackson for 2 years with Rehnquist.
Oh, is that right? I
Yeah.
never knew that.
I said, why don't you come on back? As it turns out, he's having his 50th anniversary of the Buffalo Law School, June 10th. And I'm trying to get this that week before, depending on Gerhardt's schedule. So he might be there also. So it'll be a lot of a Robert Jackson kind of reminiscencing.
Yeah. Well, that's great.
Well, you're great. I really appreciate it. Is there any question I should have asked you about Robert Jackson?
I don't think so.
Let me segue here because Dale just left a message that he's can't come. He really wants to sit down and talk to you about the town of Boston. You have been, continue to be such an integral part of that whole municipal history. From being a board member, being an attorney, to just being a concerned, interested citizen. Of course, Dale now taking on your legacy there.
Yeah, he does a great job.
When did you start on municipal politics?
Probably 1944.
So you came back from law school in 42. Was your dad involved in?
Yeah. My dad served on the town board. Actually, when he died, the board appointed me to succeed him. I was a lawyer then, and I succeeded him. And Fred Davis was supervisor. Fred Davis was chairman of the county board of supervisors.
Mm-hmm.
And Fred Davis, I think it was his mother or someone that was murdered back in 1890s or something like that. And very famous murder case in Chautauqua County, the Sherman Davis murder.
Is that right?
And it was never solved. And in the history of that thing, Fred Davis, her son, his name comes up time and time again. And I suppose there were some people that thought that he did it based on some of the things or something, I don't know. But knowing him, I could never conceive of him ever doing that. But, you know, Norm Carlson, the historian for the town of Bootey and active in the Fen and so on and so forth, he's a very bright guy. He drives a lot of readers. The Post-Journal crazy with his letters, and he's an extreme conservative. And he lets people know how he feels about things. And he's been a thorn in the side of local government for ages because of he doesn't feel government should do anything. And he thinks zoning is terrible, and so on and so forth. But anyway, Norm one day called me and said, your grandfather was one of the attorneys in connection with the Sherman Davis murder, and he said, I've been doing a lot of investigating and research on that. And he said, that's one of the interesting unsolved murder cases in history of Chautauqua County. And he said, I'm going to give a talk on that over in Fredonia next week, such and such. And he said, and I thought maybe you'd like to come over and hear it. I said, sure I would. So my wife and I went, and he is a much better writer, I mean in composition and everything, than he is a speaker. He wasn't as good a speaker as I thought. But we went, and we enjoyed it, but I enjoyed it because of my grandfather's participation in it. I can't remember. I think he had been district attorney for 2 terms, and I think this was after that. And I think that he was, I don't know how he got involved, but he was involved quite actively. I don't know whether assisting in the prosecution or something in defense of one of the suspects. But it was interesting. Well, Fred Davis was supervisor when I became a member of the board, and he was an excellent supervisor. And we've come a long way since then.
Boy, have you ever? Have the boundaries expanded at all, or have you? It stayed the same when the Howland Land Company laid out the town of Bootey. It is what it is.
Yeah. Probably the most explosive thing that happened in the last 50 years in the town of Bootey was something I started. There are editorials and debates and all sorts of things, but the town of Bootey, this isn't on now, is it?
No.
The town of Bootey, Joe Drossi was supervisor at the time, and a planning commission was appointed to enact or propose zoning ordinance for the town, which of course was controversial. But anyway, there were committees meeting all over the town opposing it and so on and so forth. And it was an ordinance that was good. Sam Alessi Sr., who lived in the town of Bootey, chairmaned the thing, and there were some top-notch people on that commission, and they worked with Ellicott and their zoning ordinance and others, and they came up with a good zoning ordinance. And so a hearing was called. They recommended this, and then the town board called for public hearing on the zoning ordinance. And needless to say, there was a big mob of people there. And there was a big group that opposed it, and the group was led by Lloyd Babcock. Remember Lloyd Babcock, the former assemblyman? And Lloyd Black, and when I was in Albany Law School, I had a job that Lloyd Babcock appointed me to. And so Lloyd had finished his term or he didn't run again. So he was then a private citizen. He was heading this group of people who were opposed to it. And it was a good ordinance. And I was so provoked when somebody moved that the ordinance, that it be rejected on the town board. And that irked me because it was a good ordinance. And they took a vote. I don't know whether Joe, I think it was Joe, was supervisor at the time. He voted aye to turn it down. Next guy, aye, me, no. And so it was turned down. And people that were there were quite happy and all. Lloyd Babcock came over and said, well, as leader of the group, I'm happy, but Bob, you did the right thing.
Really?
Yeah. He says, you did the right thing. Well, the following Monday night, there was a Kiwanis meeting in Lakewood, and I was the program chairman. And so I took that occasion to be the program. And I told about the result of this. I said, Lakewood, we have zoning, and the outskirts of Lakewood would appreciate zoning. The whole town should appreciate it, but the other end of the town, they want to live like they lived 100 years ago. And I said, it's time that we take action. And so I have a proposal. I said, I propose dividing the town of Bootey into 2 new towns in 3 steps. Number 1, go up to about the Cowing Road and call that town of Bootey. From there south, and from the Cowing Road to the lake, the town of Lakewood. And then we would later unincorporate the village of Lakewood. So we'd have only one government, town of Lakewood government, town of Bootey government. And then I had figured the things budget-wise that it would do. It would put the town of Lakewood would no longer be subsidizing the roads and snow plowing and equipment and everything that were used solely out in the town outside of the village of Lakewood. And so I laid out a whole proposal. And I had no idea that that would have the impact that it did. And then the Post-Journal ran a big story, and they put a map on the thing, how the proposal was, and so on and so forth. And you can't believe what happened for about, I don't know, maybe a month. And we had Joe Gerasi and I bet we had 5 or 6, 7 meetings throughout the town on the question of dividing the town into 2. Yeah, I took the position they should do it. It would be better for both sides. The only thing was that the people over in Bootey didn't want it. People in Lakewood, I think they would have been much in favor of it, because over in Bootey, they were able to wag the tail of the village by not having it, see? And they get so much subsidy from the village of Lakewood on these various things, and they couldn't make it alone on just being a separate town. And so they knew it. Well, anyway, we went and had these debates. Somebody would have a big group come and ask us to come and debate. We'd debate it. And then it ended up with, up at Southwestern Central School, they had the JCs up there had a big meeting. We didn't participate in it, but the JC had 2 or 3 from take each side, and then they debated it up in the high school. And the high school was full. It created an awful lot. And then there were editorials in the paper and so on and so forth. Then the Gerasi, good politician, he said, I'll draw up an ordinance that we can get passed. He said, we need zoning. He says, I'll draw up an ordinance that the people will approve. So he drew up a lousy ordinance, see. And then the planning commission, new planning commission, rubber stamped it. Town board called a public hearing. And there were very few people there. And I can't remember how it was that we went to, met over at one of the councilmen's, Earl Lawson's home over in Bootey. The board did, and voted unanimously for this zoning ordinance. And Joe said, and I agreed with him, if we pass this, it'll be awfully easy to amend it
Sure.
and make a good ordinance out of it. And that's what we did.
I'll be
They-
there. Good for you.
And so that ended all the controversy in the division of the town. But in the next election, I think out of the districts in Bootey, I ran again, and for the districts in Bootey, I think I got 6 votes or something like that. But fortunately, on the other side, I got a strong enough number of votes, so I won.
Yeah.
But I figured I wouldn't be reelected because of the controversy, and I knew that Bootey would be strongly opposed to me.
That's great. Was that your highlight, do you think, as you look back at the Bob Bootey municipal?
Well, in probably in town government, I feel that resulted in the enactment of a zoning ordinance, and eventually we would have had one anyway, but we got it much sooner. That was a unique way of doing it.
Good for you. I think that's a great story. Oh, that's terrific. Tell me about, just from a genealogical, legal genealogy, you came back with your dad, Bootey and Bootey, then your dad died. What happened then?
My dad had trouble. He didn't have diabetes, but he had circulatory problems with his legs, and he had that from 1930 on. It became increasingly bad, and then he was a heavy smoker, and in I don't know whether I was through college or in law school, but anyway, he up at our cottage up in Stowe, he had some boots on, and he was up doing something on the roof of the cottage, and came down. He said, my mother, he said, gee, he said, he got a sore toe, and took off his boot, and he had a blister on there. And the blister, instead of getting smaller and healing, it got bigger. And so finally, the doctor had him go to the hospital. And that thing wasn't healing. Dr. Cottis was his doctor. And finally, the doctor said, Ned, I'm going to take cigarettes away from you. He says, you can have 3 a day. And he said, that's all. He said, and I'm anxious to see if that'll affect this toe. And his leg was up in traction, up in the air like this, and so on. And he was in bed in the hospital. And he said, I can't go on 3 cigarettes a day. He said, I've got to have my cigarettes. He said, you can't have them because your leg's up in traction, and I'm only going to give orders to the nurse 3 a day. And so he went, and in just a few days, the thing started to heal. And in 10 days, he was back home. It was all healed up. The doctor said, let this be a lesson to you. He said, if you take up smoking again, he says, the next time you're going to lose your leg. And he said, maybe both of them. So he said, quit. My dad didn't quit. Mm-hmm. And I remember I was in law school, that's what it was. And I came home from law school for, I don't know, maybe June or May or sometime. Anyway, his other foot, he was smoking, and that leg all of a sudden started turning black and gangrene. And so they scheduled him for the hospital the next day to amputate his leg. And that night, he said to my mother, "Mary," he said, "I'm quitting smoking." And she said, "Do you think you can?" He says, "I've got to." He said, "I don't want to lose my other leg." And she said, "Okay." And she said, "But don't you ask me for a cigarette." He said, No. He said, "I'm through. Throw them away." And so she threw the cigarettes away, but she didn't tell him she had part of a carton out there or something. And she said, "Well, what if you change your mind tonight, later?" He said, "Well, don't give me one. No matter what I say or how I plead, don't give me one." Mm-hmm. And I don't know what time it was, but anyway, 12 or 1 o'clock, he woke up and said, "Mary, I've got to have a cigarette." He said, "I can't quit. I got to have a cigarette." She says, "You know that I threw the cigarettes away." And he said, "Yeah, I know it, but I've got to have one." She said, "How can I get you a cigarette?" He says, "Go to the store." She said, "What store is open at this time of night?" She said, "I'd like to get you one because I know you want it," but she said, "You made me promise I wouldn't," and so on and so forth. "I can't do it." Mm-hmm. And so he didn't have a cigarette. And the next day he went and they operated and took off his leg. And then he never smoked again. Mm-hmm. He never smoked again. But 6 months later, he lost his other leg too because it was too far gone. So during the last couple of years, maybe the 3 years I was in law school, he was not practicing. Mm-hmm. His office was there and all that, and the rent was running, but he was not practicing. And so when I graduated and came home, then we went to the office. And that was 1942. He died in 44. Mm-hmm. But he died, he worked that day in the office all day. And remember Clayt Jones? Well,
yep, sure.
Clayt was married, I think, the night that my father died, and I was supposed to be Clayt's best man. Mm-hmm. And we were at the rehearsal dinner the night before, and when my wife and I came home, we were living then with my father and mother. We came home, my mother was in the kitchen, and my dad never went to bed early. He always was late. And my mother-in-law from New York City was there visiting us for the weekend, and she'd gone up to her room, go to bed and read or something, and she was one who tended to go to bed kind of early. Came in and said, "Where's Dad?" And my mother said, "He went up to bed just a few minutes ago." And I said, "Well, gee, that's kind of early for him." She said, "Yeah." He said he didn't feel too good, so he thought he'd go to bed. So walked up the stairs, and there he was at the head of the stairs, dead, laying on the floor, dead. And after that.
Then afterwards, did you join with anybody else? Did you have a...
No, well, I did later. I practiced for a while, and then when Wayne Herrick graduated and came to town, I invited him to come in on an office sharing arrangement with me. And so we went by Bootey and Herrick for some time until Joe Gerasi came. And then we had Bootey, Herrick, and Gerasi. And then Wayne got that county job,
Mhm.
wanted to do just that, so he quit the private practice. Then Joe and Joe had the office in Lakewood, and I had an office in Jamestown, but we operated as one office.
Mhm. When did Allison Olson come into the scene?
When Fancher, well, let's see, before Fancher became judge,
Mhm.
Al Olson had worked for Fancher a few years before, and then I don't know what, and then Will Perlee, when he came to town, Olson was no longer working for Fancher, and Al and Will Perlee came to work for Fancher, and then they, I don't know what their arrangement was later, whether they became a real partnership or office sharing, but then it was ultimately Fancher and Perlee, I think.
Mhm.
And then, I don't know what happened there, but Fancher decided that he'd like to run for the judgeship. And so he invited Olson and me to come in with him. And so it was Fancher, Bootey, and Olson until Fancher left for the judgeship. And then Olson and I continued until he died.
Yeah. What kind of guy was he?
Olson, very unusual. He was very, very bright, very, very conservative. He was he never used dictating equipment. I could never understand it because I always used dictating equipment. And in fact, he didn't use dictation. He wrote everything by longhand. He could write some of the longest things that I have trouble reading my own handwriting. Shirley, who's worked there for me for years, she's the best one to read my handwriting. If I have trouble, if I've made some notes on something, and I can't read it, I'll have her come and read it. Practically everything I've ever done is by dictation, even dictate notes, and maybe some interviews, where you need to get all the facts. It's a lot quicker to put it on tape. But Olson, everything was longhand, and actually he could read it. And he could do it rapidly. He was bright. But he was real conservative. I'm conservative. But he's more so. He was more so. I mean, change was a very difficult thing for him to. Then after Fancher became Supreme Court judge, he named Olson as his clerk, and Olson was a working clerk. And Olson, in spite of the longhand, he could get a lot of work done. I don't know why he never married. He sure dated a lot. He had a girl out in Albany, and then he'd go out there and see her once in a while, and then he'd have a couple of girls in town. So he was a dating guy, but I think that he must have been one who enjoyed variety or something. I don't know. But it's funny that he never married.
And after him, you were just by yourself, and when Allison died, you were sole practitioner then, weren't you?
Yeah, until Neil.
Mm-hmm.
When Neil, I retired as town judge when Neil came. He came to work for me when I was over in the hotel, and then we became a partnership. And I guess when we became a partnership, in name, but I worked for him then. And Neil is assistant DA. It was either him giving up that job or me giving up the town job, because if as town judge I couldn't be working for an association with a DA, and so it was logical that I'd give that up, because I could give that up and get my retirement.
How long were you judge?
I don't know. I think it was 44. I think that I went in, and I was judge until 84.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was the most bizarre case you had?
The most bizarre case I had. Well, I don't know. You know, at the time, there were so many cases I thought I should hang on to this file and at least write a summary of the thing, and then someday write a book with some of these interesting things. But I didn't. And now, when I'd love to sit down and write a book on some of those things, I don't remember them. I remember one time, this was not necessarily bizarre, but experience with John Goodell on the other side made it kind of bizarre. I represented the Rochester Poster Advertising Company. They had these big billboards, and they had a billboard down in the town of Kyantone. And Kyantone adopted an ordinance prohibiting those things and giving them 30 days or 60 days to liquidate them, get rid of them. See? And Rochester Poster didn't want to take that sign down. And the owner of the land, he was the one who had the sign on his land, and the ordinance was against him. And he wanted them to take the sign down. He said, gee, they're going to sue me or charge me with violating the law. And they said, we said, we've got a contract with you, a lease, and so on. And the poor guy felt like he was in the middle of it. And he said, the sign company, will you protect me on it? And if they sue me or charge me violation or anything, will you protect me? And they said they would. Well, they charged him with a violation, and I represented the landlord and the Rochester Poster. And we went before Supreme Court up there in Mayville. I forget who the judge was. It was some guy who had been district attorney up in Erie County. And anyway, went before him, and John Goodell was arguing. He was arguing one way. He was arguing that the ordinance was all right, and that we were bound by it, and so on and so forth, and that we couldn't do what we were seeking to do. And I was arguing the other way. He was arguing, I think, that we could not proceed. Forget how that was now. But anyway, the judge was going along with him, only different grounds. So they ended up both arguing against me, but ignoring what I had to say. But arguing, Goodell then argued with the judge, no, Judge, I don't think that's a good point, but what I'm saying is it should be dismissed. Their action or proceeding should be dismissed for this. No, Mr. Goodell, I don't think so. It should be this. And anyway, I had a case where the Court of Appeals had decided that the procedure we were using was proper in this situation. And finally, I was able to interrupt them and say, Judge, I have a Court of Appeals case, whatever it was, and I said, before you make a decision against me, I'd like you to read this. So he took it up there, and he read it. He said, well, this is too important to decide from the bench. I'll reserve decision, and you'll be notified. That changed his mind, see. And then we got a decision a week later or less, ruling in our favor, saying that theirs was no good or something. Anyway, John, the law says that to enact zoning, you start with a zoning commission, planning commission, and they make a study and come up with a proposed zoning ordinance, recommend it to the town board. The town board and the planning commission has a hearing, and then the town board has to have a hearing on the question of enacting it, and there has to be certain days between. Then what John did was he had the planning commission, the town board, and everyone in the process meet on the same night, and they put the appropriate notices in the paper. Planning board meets and so to study zoning and make a report to the town board, and the town board hearing called for a meeting the same night. Everything was done, and I argued that the law calls for these things to be done in steps, and he did it in one step. See? And so I think that was what he did the second time. I don't remember what the first was. Second time, he was in such a hurry to get it done, he did it in just one step. And then the town board enacted the new zoning ordinance, which was sort of what was before, a few changes, and to take care of the problems they had before. Well, then we're back in court again. And that time they took it, I don't know how it got before Bob, what's his name, who used to be assistant DA over in Sinclairville, or Bob Seidel.
Yeah.
He was town judge. So I think that, I don't know how it got in town court, but I think county court or something referred it to him. So we went over before him and argued it, and he decided against us. But in there he said he did not feel that as town judge he could throw something out as unconstitutional. Therefore he urged that an appeal be taken to a higher court, which was all right. And so we took it up county court, and McKinley Phillips ruled in our favor. And so I don't know how long the sign stayed there, but they didn't turn around and do it right away. And by the time they got it done, the lease had expired, and we couldn't get that property anymore. But that was
That is
at the time, it was sure an interesting thing.
Absolutely. Well, this has been terrific, Bob.
Well, I don't know if
I just enjoyed this opportunity to catch up, and it's been fun.
Well, you're good at it. You're a good interviewer, and keep it moving.
It's interesting to listen to not only the Jackson vignettes, your contemporaries all have a little bit of a different story, a little different on Jackson, but it's you get into the other side, the practice of law. Frankly, it's a time, you hate to admit it, which is past. As far as yours was truly a profession.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we're really a business.
Yeah.
And you hate to even talk about that, but it's unfortunately true. It's a law business as opposed to a law profession.
Well, I wonder if that didn't take a big step towards business when advertising was permitted.
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. I still don't think I could advertise.
And I know our firm has a terrible time, even on our Buffalo levels of, we'll do the symphony. Something at Shays or Kleinhans will be the sponsors.
Yeah.
And that's about as far as we can go.
Yeah.
We just can't get beyond that.
Well, I've got where I don't mind it. Over there at Pheasant, I mean, they have some tie-up with Siegel, Keller and Kahn, and so on and so forth. And they advertise on their own, too.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think of it as badly as I used to.
When it first came up, because it was so different.
Yeah. I was in law school when I think my senior year. I went to law school a few days early, and I went up to the school and went in and sat down and was talking to the dean, Andrew Clements, and I said, do you have an interesting class coming this year? And he said, yeah, we do. I said, in what respect? And he said, we've got one fellow who's going to be a freshman this year who holds more degrees than any man in the world, with the exception of Herbert Hoover. I said, really? He said, yeah. And I said, you mean Hoover holds the most degrees? And he said, yeah. He holds 56 degrees. And he says, our new freshman this year holds 52 or 3 or something like that. I said, who in the world could that be? He said, Dr. Frank Pierpont Graves. Now, I don't know whether you ever remember Dr. Frank Pierpont Graves or not, but he was the Commissioner of Education in the state of New York from 1918, I think, up until 1941 or 2 or something like that. And that name was so familiar because every kid that went through the school system knew Dr. Graves' name. Mm-hmm. Well, in law school, one of the first things that they have is the reception for the freshmen. It's unique in that the freshman class has to put on the show. Okay. And so the other classes, everyone goes in the auditorium the time of the performance, and then the curtains are drawn, and then they proceed with their show, whatever they've come up with. And we wondered what Dr. Graves, here he's a freshman, he had to retire at 70, I guess, from the state, and president of the University of the State of New York, Commissioner of Education, and he'd been president of several universities and colleges throughout the country before he was, in 1918, he was named that. Anyway, so we were anxious to see if he would even show up for this silly performance that would be put on. And finally the house lights dimmed and the curtains separated, and out steps Dr. Graves. See? And he said, probably the first thing that we should do is decide what I'm to be called. He said, I think probably everyone here that graduated from high school and went to school in the state of New York, you knew me, you knew of me. And he said, your parents did too, because they probably went to school to me too. He said, but it wouldn't seem appropriate if I'm a freshman that you seniors call me Dr. Graves. And he said, that wouldn't be right. And he says, and I don't think that you should call me Frank. And he said, so I've given a lot of thought, and I think maybe the best thing is just everyone call me Pops. And that's what and probably the next thing was a clam bake or something, and softball game we had. And everyone in the school would go, and we'd have clams and raw clams, baked clams and oysters and everything, barrel of beer. Then we'd have 2 teams playing, or 3 teams, and 4 or whatever it was, and then have sort of a round robin softball. And it was a whole day affair. It was an awful lot of fun. Well, again, we wondered if Dr. Graves, what in the world would he do? And got there, and all of a sudden he arrived. And he was the umpire in the softball games. But he drank beer, and he had the other things too, and he stayed for the whole time. And he was a great guy. And his closest friend in law school was a Jamestown boy. You remember Smith Jewelry?
Yeah.
Well, Ernie Smith's son, Marshall, went to law school. And he was a freshman. It'd been the same time that Graves was. And the education building has an excellent law library. And the school does too. But my roommate and we used to study down at the education building law library more than we did at the school law library, because there was a lot more private.
Mm-hmm.
You get a big table like this, and there weren't a lot of people in there. And so we loved to go there. Well, Dr. Graves and Marshall Smith, they went there nights, because Dr. Graves had permanent access to the education building and so on and so forth. So he and Marshall would go down there, and they'd do their studying there. And it was an interesting thing. We had exams. I don't know. Where'd you go, Buffalo?
I went to Dickinson Law School down in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Where was that?
Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, when we took exams, there would be seniors, sophomores, and freshmen mixed in each classroom. Each of the freshman, sophomore, and senior classrooms, they'd mix them so you didn't have seniors together and so on and so forth. And so I remember, I think it was one of the first exams, and Dr. Graves was in the same test room that I was in. And I remember, partway through the test, all of a sudden Dr. Graves got up from his seat back here, and walked down. It was like this. Walked down to where the professor was and asked him something. And the professor says, "You'll have to figure that out for yourself. It's in the instructions. I can't tell you. You go back and read the instructions." So he goes back, sits down a few minutes, he'd walk down again. About the third or fourth time he came down to ask something, they said, "You're excused from the class." And he never took another exam.
Really?
Never took another exam. And so we all figured, well, maybe he'll go through the process of learning classes and all that, but not take the exams, that maybe he just can't, at his age, cope with exams or something. And he went through school that way, and I don't think he ever took another exam in college, of course, or in law school. Of course, I wasn't there the second 2 years, but he didn't have freshman year. But after he graduated, he must have taken the bar exams, because he became an attorney. And the next year, I think it was, he was appointed as counsel for the New York State Teachers Association.
No kidding.
Yeah. And he served as their attorney probably until he died. I don't know when he died. But anyway, it was interesting. After I think our first course, among the first courses, was a course in legal ethics. And it was real interesting. About the time that course was completed and all, there was a meeting of the New York State Teachers Association in Albany. And I remember the Albany Times Union had headlines, "Dr. Frank Pierpont Graves to address teachers union." See? And then when they reported on the meeting and the speech, Dr. Graves speaks on ethics in the legal profession.
Oh, that's great.
That was quite an experience to see him. Marshall Smith, I think after the first or second year, he dropped out of law school. And then he went into the ministry. And he became Nelson Rockefeller's minister.
No kidding.
He married Rockefeller and Happy, and I think he was a minister down in the Hudson.
See, that's a vignette I would never know.
Yeah. And I don't know what's become of him since. I'm sure he's a minister down there, and probably a pretty good minister. He had a nice voice, nice voice, but he was a little different. Well, I've taken up enough.
I've taken a lot of your time. I'm thrilled that you took the time to come in and talk about this.
Well, I'm glad to do it. I don't know what it's worth, but
it's worth a lot, and you'll have fun probably kibitzing sometime the first week in June.
You'll have it, huh?
Yeah, we'll have the centennial, and hopefully with Mr. Gerhardt, Gene Gerhardt, and George Niebank, and all you guys could who interfaced with Jackson can have a photo op. Nothing else.
Now, George Niebank, when my wife was young, I think he must be about the same age as my wife, which is 72. Because he was one of the boys up in that general neighborhood that she mentions, him and two or three other guys.
Yeah, well, George apparently was the clerk for Jackson in 51 and 52.
Mm-hmm.
And the other clerk would have been Rehnquist. I wrote a letter to Rehnquist, just seeing if he would reminisce.
Mm-hmm.
Long story short. 2 days ago, I come back from lunch, and my secretary says, there's this call from a Judy Tremonti who says she's the clerk for, and then she's reading it, some Chief Judge Rehnquist. I said, that's a good call. I tell you what, I'll respond. I'll return this call for you. No problem. So she was, A, acknowledged the receipt of the letter, B, that the Chief Justice would put something together in remembrance of his time with Jackson, which would be great.
Yeah.
And thirdly, was looking for an address for Niebank, which then caused me to track down Jim's Niebank's widow, I think her name's Joanne, to get the address. And I called George. I talked to George, see if he'd come back, and he might. It may coordinate nicely with his 50th.
So he and Rehnquist were together at the same time for Jackson. Well, that's quite a thrill.
Yeah.
Why?
And he subsequently went on to be legal counsel to a couple of railroad companies.
Yeah.
A successful career, Washington guy.
Well, I would imagine so. I can't think of any better preparation for a successful law practice than clerking for a Supreme Court judge.
I know. I told him that Eugene Gerhardt would be coming here, and I frankly think it's a big deal. A, the guy's very active down in Binghamton. He wrote the book. He interviewed him greatly. George has a little different spin on the book. He read the book at the time when it came out, and he said, it did not play to critical acclaim. I want you to know that, Greg.
Is that right?
I said, okay. To me, it covers a lot of the early history stuff. In fact, I gave a copy to Neil. If you have any interest in reading it, I've got an extra copy that Neil Robinson's got down in your office.
Uh-huh.
But hopefully he'll be back. And his secretary I mentioned, who went, or may not have mentioned, she went with Gerhardt to Washington to do the interviews at various times from a period 1948 to 54. And she's still with Gerhardt, very sharp, and has a whole different perspective, not different, but a woman's perspective of the kind of guy Jackson was. And so I've invited both of them to come to be on the dais, not only because Gerhardt wrote it, but here's the secretary. As in all our professions, if you harken back, there's been a level of secretaries that have sort of kept you on the straight and narrow,
Yeah.
And wonderful. She's been there for 50-some years,
Oh, boy.
Gerhardt, and still runs the ship at this fairly large law firm down there.
Well, you know, now that I'm, what little practice I do, which is very little, is out of my home with a computer, so on and so forth. But I didn't realize until I started doing it how dependent I was or am on Shirley. And I'm always calling her about something that she always did that I never knew how.
Yeah.
Like as plain as simple as on real estate deals. Who pays the recording on the Gaines affidavit or, you know,
Yeah.
something like that? I've never worried about that.
Yeah.
And and I feel so stupid.
We're all there.
And I said to my wife, I said, geez, I don't know whether I should be practicing or not. I'm always having to call Shirley and ask her out.
I'm sure she's thrilled that you do call.
Probably.
Yeah.
And she probably talks to me in front of all the other girls there too, and that probably gives her a big charge.
Oh, that's great. Again, thanks so much, Bob. I really appreciate
Okay, well, I'm glad you asked me. But I remember his grandmother.
Really?
His grandmother. And one time I was telling Kurt Tabor that. He says, you don't mean Wilson Price's grandmother? And I said, yes, Wilson's grandmother. And he says, no way. And one day he asked Chuck. And Chuck said, sure. My dad's grandmother lived in the house next door. And I remember when she was 103 or 4, when she went down the hill, I don't know what street it was, maybe Crosman, between Lakeview and Windsor, I guess, is downhill. And I think that the voting place for that district was down there. And she walked down to cast her vote for somebody.
Wow.
And I remember I lived just 3 houses from Chuck Price, and so he and I were played together as kids. And I remember going into his great-grandmother's a lot of times, and I thought, this house is so old. The furniture in there, the house in there was very nice, but the furniture was all old. It wasn't broken down or dilapidated, but the room had kind of dark paper, and it wasn't like what I was accustomed to, or I'm sure Chuck wasn't accustomed to, because I was in their home bunch. But it was old furniture, and I remember her so well, and she was so old and so sweet and so nice. But when you think that how old Chuck's dad would be today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He was older than my father. My dad was born in 1878. He was an amazing guy. Well,